Thunder splits the ancient sky, a sound so violent it seems to tear the fabric of existence itself. In the frozen north, Viking warriors pressed their faces to the earth, while thousands of miles south, Greek farmers clutched their children as lightning turns night into blinding day. Two civilizations, separated by vast oceans and endless miles, united only in their terror of gods who could erase them with a single bolt from the heavens. But here is the question that should unsettle us all. What if the gods we created, the deities we prostrated ourselves before, were nothing more than mirrors held up to our own savage souls? What if Thor and Zeus, both crowned with lightning, both commanding the storm, were not revelations of divine truth but confessions of our darkest impulses? These thunder gods could not be more different, and in those differences lies a terrifying truth about the cultures that birthed them. The Norse demanded blood on altars, sacrifices screaming into the void. The Greeks whispered of their king of gods descending as swan, as bull, as golden rain, taking mortal women whether they fled or fought. In the collision of hammers and the hurling of thunderbolts, in cosmic battles that shook the pillars of reality, we find humanity's most primal fears given form and granted dominion over existence itself. We worshipped our own darkness and called it heaven. Blood runs in the veins of the divine, just as it does in mortals. But when gods are born, the blood flows in rivers that reshape the cosmos itself. The stories we tell about the births of deities reveal truths we often try to forget, that creation and destruction are inseparable twins, that new order can only emerge from the ashes of violent revolution, and that the gods we worship carry the stains of unspeakable acts upon their very essence. In the beginning, according to the ancient Greek poet Hesiod, whose theogony serves as our earliest comprehensive account of divine genealogy, there was chaos. From this primordial void emerged Gaia, the earth, and from her came Uranos, the sky. These cosmic parents began the first dynasty of divine beings, the Titans, but their reign would be poisoned by a curse that would echo through generations: the fear of being overthrown by one's own children. Uranos, the Sky Father, grew to despise his offspring. In his paranoia and cruelty, he forced them back into the womb of Gaia, trapping them within the earth herself. The pain Gaia endured was unimaginable, her body stretched and torn by the children she could not release. In her agony, she fashioned a great sickle from adamant, a substance harder than diamond, and she whispered a desperate plea to her imprisoned children. "Who among you will help me take vengeance upon your father for his terrible deeds?" Only Kronos, the youngest of the Titans, possessed the courage, or perhaps the ambition, to accept his mother's weapon. He concealed himself and waited. When Uranos descended to lie with Gaia, spreading himself across her in the eternal coupling of sky and earth, Kronos struck with savage efficiency. He reached out with the adamantine sickle and castrated his father, severing the genitals of the sky itself. The blood that spilled from this cosmic wound did not simply disappear. It splattered upon the earth, and from these divine drops were born the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance, and the Giants, beings of enormous power and rage. The severed genitals themselves fell into the sea, and from the foam that churned around them arose Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, born from an act of ultimate violation. Kronos took his father's throne, but he had learned the wrong lesson from Uranos' downfall. Rather than ruling with wisdom and breaking the cycle of violence, he became consumed by the same paranoid fear that had destroyed his father. He had heard the prophecy, whispered by Gaia and Uranos in their pain. One of Kronos' own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. The curse of succession would continue, generation after generation, unless he could find a way to stop it. His solution was monstrous in its simplicity. As his wife and sister Rhea gave birth to each divine child, Kronos would take the infant and swallow it whole, trapping his own offspring in the darkness of his belly. One by one, he consumed them. First Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, who would become goddess of the harvest. Hera, future queen of the gods, disappeared down her father's throat. Hades, lord of the underworld, followed his sisters into that living tomb. And finally Poseidon, who would one day rule the seas, joined his siblings in the eternal prison of their father's gut. These were not corpses rotting in Kronos' stomach. The gods are immortal, and so the children of Kronos and Rhea remained alive in that horrible darkness, growing, waiting, aware of their imprisonment. Imagine the psychology of such an existence. To be born divine, filled with cosmic power, only to be immediately swallowed into suffocating blackness by your own father. This was the fate that awaited Zeus. But Rhea, mother of these imprisoned gods, finally reached her breaking point. When she felt Zeus stirring in her womb, she could not bear to see another child condemned to that fate. She fled to the island of Crete, to a cave on Mount Ida, or perhaps Mount Dicte. The ancient sources disagree on this detail, but agree on the secrecy and desperation of the birth. There, in darkness and pain, she brought Zeus into the world. To deceive her husband, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented this to Kronos. The Titan king, so consumed by fear that he could not even look at what he was swallowing, gulped down the rock without noticing the substitution. The infant Zeus was hidden away and raised by the nymphs of Crete. Some sources say he was fed on the milk of the goat Amalthea, others that bees brought him honey and the mythical Meliae nymphs nurtured him. The curates, warrior priests, clashed their spears against their shields to drown out the baby's cries, ensuring that Kronos would not hear his son and come seeking him. Zeus grew to maturity in secret, gathering his strength, planning his revenge. When Zeus reached adulthood, he sought the help of Metis, the titaness of wisdom and cunning. Together they concocted a potion, a mixture so powerful it could force even a titan to vomit. Zeus, in disguise, approached his father and tricked Kronos into drinking this emetic. The effect was immediate and violent. Kronos' body convulsed, and he began to regurgitate the children he had swallowed. First came the stone that had been given to him in place of Zeus, then Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and finally Hestia. They emerged in reverse order, fully grown gods who had spent years or perhaps aeons trapped in their father's belly, and they were ready for war. What followed was the Titanomachy, a cosmic conflict that lasted for 10 full years. This was not a war of mortal armies clashing on earthly battlefields. This was reality itself being torn apart. Zeus and his siblings, the Olympian gods, fought against Kronos and most of the other titans. The weapons they wielded were forces of nature themselves. Zeus hurled thunderbolts forged by the Cyclopes, whom he had freed from the prison of Tartarus. Poseidon struck with earthquakes that shattered mountains. The earth burned and the seas boiled. The very fabric of the cosmos trembled under the violence of this divine conflict. The war only turned decisively in favor of the Olympians when Zeus descended into the deepest pit of the underworld and freed the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants who had been imprisoned there since the beginning of time. These beings of ultimate power joined Zeus's cause, and their intervention proved unstoppable. They hurled entire mountains at the Titans, 300 hands working in terrifying coordination. The Titans fell one by one and were cast down into Tartarus, that prison as far below the earth as heaven is above it. Kronos himself was bound in unbreakable chains, condemned to eternal imprisonment for the crimes of infanticide and tyranny. Zeus had won through violence and cunning, through alliance building and ruthless warfare. He became king of the gods not through divine right, but through bloody conquest. The violence of his origin, born into a family defined by castration and cannibalism, shaped everything he would become. The king of Olympus carried the trauma of his birth with him forever. Now shift your attention northward, beyond the Mediterranean world, beyond the reaches of Greek civilization, to the frozen forests and harsh mountains of Scandinavia. Here, in a world of bitter winters and brief summers, the Norse people developed their own understanding of the divine, and their gods reflected the brutal reality of their existence. Thor, the thunder god, was born under very different circumstances than Zeus, yet his origin is no less violent in its implication. According to the Prose Edda, written by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, Thor was the son of Odin, the Allfather, chief of the Aesir gods. But his mother was not one of the Aesir, or even one of the Vanir, the other tribe of Norse deities. Thor's mother was Jord, whose name means simply earth. She was the personification of the land itself, the soil and stone of Midgard. This parentage is critically important to understanding Thor's nature and his role in Norse cosmology. While Zeus was born from a line of sky gods, cosmic beings whose conflicts played out in the heavens, Thor was literally born from the union of divine consciousness and earthly matter. He was half god and half earth, a bridge between the celestial realm of Asgard and the physical world where humans struggled to survive. The Norse people saw their champion as fundamentally connected to the land they farmed, the soil that fed them, the ground they would one day be buried in. But Thor was born into a cosmos already shadowed by doom. The Norse understanding of time was not cyclical in the Greek sense, nor was it progressive in the modern sense. Instead, it was apocalyptic. From the very beginning of creation, the Norns, those three weavers of fate, had foreseen Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the final battle in which nearly everything would be destroyed. This prophecy hung over the Norse gods like a death sentence they could read, but not avoid. The very structure of Norse creation myth is violent and unsettling. In the beginning was the void called Ginnungagap, flanked by the realm of fire, Muspelheim, and the realm of ice, Niflheim. Where the heat and cold met, the giant Ymir was born from the melting ice. Ymir was a hermaphroditic being, and from his body more giants were born. The first gods, including Odin and his brothers, were descendants of beings born from Ymir's sweat and the cosmic cow Audhumla, who licked the ice. These first gods looked upon Ymir and decided to kill him. They slaughtered the primordial giant, and the violence of this act was staggering. So much blood poured from Ymir's wounds that it flooded the cosmos, drowning almost all of the giants who had descended from him. From Ymir's corpse, Odin and his brothers built the world itself. His flesh became the earth, his blood the oceans, his bones the mountains, his teeth the rocks and stones, his hair the trees and vegetation, his skull the dome of heaven held up by four dwarves, and his brain became the clouds. This is the world into which Thor was born, a reality literally constructed from the butchered body of a murdered god. Thor grew to become the strongest of the gods, wielder of Mjolnir, the hammer that could level mountains and whose throw would always return to his hand. He was the defender of Asgard and Midgard against the giants, those beings who represented chaos and destruction. But his entire existence was fundamentally defensive. Unlike Zeus, who overthrew a tyrant to establish a new order, Thor was fighting a holding action against inevitable doom. The prophecies were clear and terrible. At Ragnarok, the great wolf Fenrir would break his chains. The world serpent Jormungandr would rise from the oceans. The dead would sail from hell in a ship made of fingernails. The fire giant Surtur would march from Muspelheim with a flaming sword, and the gods would gather to fight their final battle. Thor himself was prophesied to face Jormungandr, the world's serpent, his ancient enemy. He would kill the serpent, but he would only be able to take 9 steps before falling dead himself, poisoned by the creature's venom. This knowledge of his own doom fundamentally shaped Thor's character. He was not fighting to establish eternal order, as Zeus had. He was fighting to delay the inevitable, to protect humanity and the gods for as long as possible before the final darkness came. His violence against the giants was not about conquest or domination, but about survival in a cosmos that was always sliding toward destruction. The contrast between these two divine births reveals profound differences in worldview. Zeus emerged from a cycle of violence that he broke through superior force and cunning, establishing a new order that would theoretically last forever. His overthrow of Kronos was presented as progress, as the replacement of a paranoid tyrant with a more just, if still flawed, ruler. The Greek gods were immortal, and their reign was eternal. Barring another revolution, Thor, born from the earth itself, was tied to a land that would one day burn. His existence was always temporary, always under threat. The Norse gods were not truly immortal, they merely extended their lives by eating the golden apples of Idun, and even that would not save them from Ragnarok. The violence embedded in Thor's creation story was not the violence of revolution, but the violence of cosmic sacrifice, the blood price paid to create a world that was always doomed. Both gods carry the stains of their violent origins, but those stains mean different things. Zeus's blood-soaked birth gave him the kingship of heaven and the authority to rule. Thor's emergence from the murdered body of Ymir bound him to defend a world built on death. One god was born from patricide and became a king. The other was born from the earth and became a guardian of the doomed. User, Describe each god's first kill in detail. In the deepest chambers of the earth, where light had never touched stone, 3 brothers worked in eternal darkness. The Cyclopes, each bearing a single eye that had witnessed horrors beyond mortal comprehension, hammered at their forge not as free artisans, but as traumatized survivors of divine cruelty. For uncounted eons, Zeus's father Kronos had imprisoned them in Tartarus, that lightless pit beneath even the underworld itself, where the screams of the damned echoed off walls that breathed with malevolence. When Zeus finally freed them during the Great War against the Titans, the Cyclopes emerged broken, their massive hands trembling, their single eyes unable to meet the gaze of their liberator. But they understood debt, and they understood vengeance. What they forged in gratitude would become the most feared weapon in all mythology. The thunderbolt they created was not merely a tool of war. Brontes, stirrups, and arges poured their trauma into every spark, every fold of celestial fire. They had stared into absolute darkness for so long that when they finally shaped light into weaponized form, it carried the weight of their suffering. The bolt they presented to Zeus could turn a living being into ash between one heartbeat and the next, leaving behind only a scorched outline and the acrid smell of cooked flesh. This was not the clean death of a sword or the honest brutality of a club. This was obliteration, the complete erasure of matter and spirit alike. Zeus took his new weapon to the heights of Mount Olympus, and from that elevated throne, he became judge, jury, and executioner to all who walked the earth below. The distance was crucial to understanding his nature. He did not wade into battle like a common soldier. He did not feel the spray of blood on his face or hear the final gasps of his victims. From Olympus, mortals appeared as small as insects, and Zeus developed the detachment of a god who kills without consequence, without proximity, without the mess of actual combat. Consider the fate of Salmoneus, the mortal king who dared to claim equality with Zeus. This was not a warrior who threatened Olympus with armies, but merely a fool who dragged bronze cauldrons behind his chariot to mimic thunder, who threw torches into the sky to pretend at lightning. For this theatrical blasphemy, Zeus needed only to extend his arm from his throne room, sight along the length of his bolt, and release. The weapon streaked through the sky faster than thought itself, drawn to its target like a predator to prey. When it struck Salmoneus, witnesses say there was a flash brighter than the sun, a crack that shattered windows in nearby cities, and then nothing. Where the king had stood, only a smoking crater remained, the sand fused into glass, still glowing red with residual heat. His body was never found, because there was no body to find, only dispersed atoms and the memory of a man who had been. The bolt struck Asclepius with equal mercilessness. The physician had committed the unforgivable sin of becoming too skilled at his craft, of learning to resurrect the dead, and thereby disrupting the natural order that kept mortals appropriately fearful of death. Zeus did not descend to argue philosophy or issue warnings. He simply released his weapon from on high, and Asclepius, who had healed countless thousands, who had devoted his existence to preserving life, became a scattered pattern of ash upon his clinic floor. His patients found him the next morning, or what remained of him, the outline of a man burned into stone, like a shadow frozen in time. The lightning bolt killed with such speed that victims rarely had time to register their own deaths. There was no struggle, no final words, no chance for redemption or escape. Just the sudden transition from being to nothingness, mediated by a weapon that cared nothing for its targets, wielded by a god who need never look his victims in the eye. Now turn your gaze northward, to the realm of fire and ice, where a different kind of divine weapon took shape under vastly different circumstances. In the underground halls of Svartalfheim, the dwarven brothers Sindri and Brokkr worked their forge with pride rather than trauma, with artistry rather than obligation. But their greatest creation would be marred not by their own limitations, but by the interference of the trickster god Loki, who could never resist corrupting perfection with chaos. Loki had made a foolish wager, betting his own head that the brothers could not forge 3 gifts worthy of the gods. As Sindri worked the bellows and Brokkr shaped the metal, Loki transformed himself into a biting fly, landing on Brokkr's eyelid at the most critical moment of the forging process. The dwarf, determined not to lose his rhythm despite the stinging pain, refused to swat the insect away. but the distraction caused him to cease pumping the bellows just seconds too early. The result was Mjolnir, a hammer of incomparable power and perfect balance, but cursed with a handle too short for proper throwing, too abbreviated for the elegant distance of ranged combat. This flaw defined everything about how Thor would fight, how he would kill, how he would understand his role as protector of Asgard and Midgard. Where Zeus could strike from the comfort of his palace, Thor had to enter the fray. The short handle meant Mjolnir was a close-quarters weapon, a tool for gods who did not mind giant blood soaking into their beards, who welcomed the crunch of bone beneath their blows, who laughed in the faces of enemies even as those enemies breathed their last. The hammer became an extension of Thor's savage joy in combat. When he fought the giant Thrym, who had stolen Mjolnir and demanded the goddess Freya as his bride in exchange for its return, Thor disguised himself as the bride and attended the wedding feast. The sagas tell us he ate an entire ox, 8 salmon, and 3 barrels of mead, arousing the giant's suspicion. But when Thrym foolishly placed Mjolnir in Thor's lap as part of the marriage ceremony, blessing the bride with the sacred hammer according to tradition, the thunder god's disguise fell away like a discarded cloak. The first blow caught Thrym in the center of his skull, caving it inward with such force that brain matter sprayed across the wedding guests. Thor did not stop with the thief. He waded through the hall, Mjolnir rising and falling in brutal rhythm, painting the walls with giant blood. Every guest at that wedding died before they could rise from their seats, skulls shattered, rib cages crushed, bodies broken so thoroughly that they could never be burned properly according to giant funeral rites. This was not the distant judgment of Zeus, but the intimate violence of a warrior who understood that protecting the innocent meant getting close enough to smell the fear of the guilty. When Thor fought the giant Ragnarok in single combat, the giant threw a massive whetstone that should have killed the thunder god. Thor responded by hurling Mjolnir, and the hammer struck with such apocalyptic force that it shattered both the whetstone and Ragnar's skull simultaneously. Fragments of the whetstone embedded themselves in Thor's head, where they remained as permanent reminders of the battle. A piece of Ragnar's skull lodged in the earth so deeply that it became a mountain. Thor himself fell, pinned beneath the giant's massive leg, soaked in gore, triumphant but trapped. The magic of Mjolnir ensured it always returned to Thor's hand after each throw, but the short handle meant those throws were less common, reserved for moments of absolute necessity. Most of the time, Thor held his weapon close, swinging it in devastating arcs, bringing it down on giant skulls and serpent spines with the methodical efficiency of a butcher at work. When he sailed to the edge of the world with the giant king, Asgard, and attempted to lift what he thought was a cat, he was actually grasping the world serpent itself, managing to pull it partially from the ocean through sheer strength. Later, when fishing with the giant Hymir, Thor hooked that same serpent, the monstrous Jormungandr, and as it rose from the depths, he reached for Mjolnir, prepared to bash in the creature's skull at point-blank range. Only Hymir's terror-driven interference prevented that killing blow, cutting Thor's fishing line before the hammer could fall. These weapons reveal the fundamental nature of the gods who wielded them. Zeus's lightning bolt was forged by the traumatized, wielded by the distant, employed by one who saw himself as above the messy reality of combat. It killed instantly, mercifully in its speed, if not its intent, reducing targets to ash before they could process their own mortality. It was the weapon of a tyrant who demanded worship through fear, who maintained order through the threat of instantaneous annihilation from an unreachable height. Mjolnir, born from Loki's interference and dwarven pride, flawed but fearsome, belonged to a god who understood that protection required presence, that justice sometimes meant standing knee-deep in the blood of those who threatened the innocent. Thor's violence was not clean, or distant, or theoretical. It was visceral, immediate, honest in its brutality. He did not pretend that maintaining cosmic order was a philosophical exercise conducted from throne rooms. He knew it meant shattered bones and torn flesh, and the weight of giant corpses collapsing across battlefield mud. In the end, both weapons served as extensions of divine will, but the methods of their employment could not have been more different. Zeus, the distant judge; Thor, the present executioner. Lightning that erases, hammer that crushes. One forged in darkness by the traumatized, the other shaped with pride, but marked by trickster interference. one designed for distance, the other cursed into intimacy. Both terrifying, both unstoppable, both revealing that when gods choose violence, mortal concepts of mercy become meaningless. The weapons themselves became characters in cosmic dramas, their dark origins forever staining the myths they inhabited. Their brutal applications reminding all who heard these stories that divine power, however justified, however necessary, always carries the stench of scorched flesh, or the copper tang of spilled blood. In the shadowed galleries of the Louvre, tourists pause before a particular painting without fully understanding the horror it depicts. Rembrandt's Europa sits astride a white bull, her attendants waving from a distant shore that grows smaller with each passing moment. The guides speak of mythology and artistic symbolism, but they rarely mention what comes next in the story, the part that follows after the bull swims beyond the reach of screaming voices. This sanitized silence around Zeus, king of the Greek gods, represents one of the most disturbing normalizations in Western culture, a divine mythology built on a foundation of sexual violence that would make modern audiences recoil if presented without the softening filter of classical education and artistic distance. The Zeus who appears in Greek mythology is not merely flawed in the way we might accept complexity in fictional characters. He is something far more unsettling, a supreme deity whose primary mythological activity involves the systematic hunting, deceiving, and assaulting of mortals who possess no ability to refuse him, no capacity to escape, and no hope of justice. What makes this particularly disturbing is not just the acts themselves, but the elaborate mechanisms Zeus employed to make resistance impossible, transforming himself into forms that stripped his victims of even the opportunity for consent. Consider the myth of Europa, the Phoenician princess whose name would eventually grace an entire continent. The sanitized version taught in schools mentions Zeus taking the form of a gentle white bull, beautiful and tame, who knelt before Europa and her companions as they gathered flowers by the sea. The accounts describe how Europa, charmed by this docile creature, climbed onto its back. Only then did the bull's nature change. It plunged into the sea and swam with increasing speed toward Crete, carrying the terrified princess away from everything and everyone she had ever known. Her screams carried back to shore where her attendants could do nothing but watch her disappear. The gods of Olympus did not intervene. No divine justice manifested. Zeus brought her to Crete, where, still in his true form, or perhaps still disguised, he raped her in a cave or beneath a plane tree, depending on which version of the myth you encounter. She bore him 3 children, including Minos, who would become king of Crete. Greek culture remembered this not as a crime, but as an honor, a divine selection that elevated Europa's status. Her terror, her lack of choice, the violence of her abduction, all of this dissolved into the glory of having been chosen by the king of gods. The transformation itself served a specific purpose. As a bull, Zeus became something Europa could not recognize as a threat until escape became impossible. She showed the creature affection, trust even, before understanding what it truly was. This is the mechanism of predation refined to its most disturbing form, the removal of informed decision-making, the weaponization of deception. Leda's story takes this horror into even stranger territory. The Queen of Sparta encountered Zeus in the form of a swan. Different versions of the myth offer slightly different narratives, some suggesting the swan sought protection from an eagle, playing on Leda's compassion. Others simply describe the swan approaching her as she bathed. The result remains constant across versions. Zeus, in swan form, raped her. The biological absurdity of the act, the physical incompatibility of the forms, never troubled the mythmakers. Leda laid eggs from which hatched Helen, whose face would launch 1,000 ships, and Pollux, one of the divine Dioscuri twins. Ancient Greek art depicts this encounter frequently, vase paintings and sculptures showing the swan's wings wrapping around Leda's body. Renaissance artists would later paint the scene with disturbing sensuality, Michelangelo and Leonardo, both creating versions that aestheticized the assault. The cultural memory transformed rape into romance, violence into divine favor. Leda's trauma, the impossibility of consent when facing a god in animal form, simply evaporated from the narrative. replaced by pride in her extraordinarily beautiful daughter and her heroic sons. Danae's imprisonment reveals a different dimension of Zeus's predation. Her father, King Acrisius of Argos, received a prophecy that his grandson would kill him. To prevent this, he locked Danae in a bronze chamber, sealing her away from all male contact. The lengths to which her father went, the complete isolation, the bronze walls, all prove insufficient against Zeus. He transformed himself into golden rain and seeped through the ceiling, infiltrating her prison and impregnating her. When she gave birth to Perseus, Acrisius sealed both mother and infant in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. The myth treats Zeus's violation as ingenious rather than monstrous. He found a way, as he always did. Danae's complete helplessness, locked in a bronze chamber with no possibility of escape or refusal, raised no moral questions for the ancient audiences. The golden rain became a popular artistic subject, painters across centuries depicting the moment of violation as beautiful, erotic even. The shower of gold falling on Danae's naked body became a symbol of divine blessing, rather than what it actually represented, the penetration of a woman's prison by her rapist. The abduction of Ganymede adds another layer of horror. Zeus, seeing the beautiful young Trojan prince tending sheep on Mount Ida, desired him. Transforming into an eagle, the king of gods swooped down and carried the boy to Olympus. There, Zeus made him his cupbearer and lover. The myth celebrates this as Ganymede receiving immortality and eternal youth, positioned as a gift. The terror of a child torn from earth by a predatory bird, carried into the sky to serve the sexual desires of an all-powerful deity, receives no acknowledgement. Ancient sources debate Ganymede's age at abduction, some suggesting he was a child, others a young adolescent, but none suggest he possessed the power or maturity to consent to what followed. The eagle became Zeus's symbol, appearing on coins and standards, a predator bird representing divine authority. The connection to Ganymede's abduction simply faded into symbolic abstraction. What makes the Zeus mythology particularly disturbing is not merely the catalog of assaults, but the systematic way Greek culture wove these stories into their understanding of divine right and cosmic order. Zeus's sexual violence was not portrayed as a flaw or corruption, but as an expression of his power and vitality. The transformer god, capable of becoming anything, used these abilities primarily to facilitate assault. His shape-shifting represented the ultimate removal of choice. He could become whatever would lower his victim's guard, whatever would make escape impossible. Even more horrifying is the role of Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods. Rather than directing her rage at her serial predator husband, Hera consistently punished Zeus's victims. When Zeus impregnated Io, Hera transformed the young woman into a cow and sent a gadfly to sting her across the earth in endless torment. Callisto, raped by Zeus when he disguised himself as Artemis, was transformed into a bear by Hera and nearly killed by her own son while hunting. Semele, tricked into demanding Zeus reveal his true form, was incinerated by the sight. The pattern repeats across dozens of myths. The women Zeus violated faced Hera's vengeance, while Zeus faced no consequences. This dynamic reveals something deeply disturbing about how Greek culture processed sexual violence. The victim bore responsibility, absorbed punishment, while the perpetrator's actions were simply accepted as expressions of power. Greek philosophy and drama occasionally questioned Zeus's behavior, but always within careful limits. The culture that gave us democracy, geometry, and theater also normalized a mythology where the supreme cosmic authority was a serial predator who used deception and overwhelming power to assault those who could not refuse him. Teachers and priests told these stories to children. Artists celebrated them in temples. Poets sang of them at festivals. The normalization was complete and comprehensive. Now contrast this with Thor, the Norse god often positioned as a rough cultural equivalent, a sky deity associated with thunder and kingship. The difference is stark and immediate. Thor's mythology centers almost entirely on combat with giants, monsters, and cosmic threats. His most famous stories involve retrieving his stolen hammer, fishing for the world serpent, and defending Asgard from Jotun invasions. Sexual conquest appears almost nowhere in his narrative cycle. Thor is married to Sif, the golden-haired goddess, and their relationship appears stable and respectful across the Norse sources. When Loki cuts off Sif's hair as a cruel prank, Thor's rage drives the entire narrative to restore what was taken from his wife. The Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, our primary sources for Norse mythology, contain no stories of Thor pursuing unwilling mortals, no tales of deception and assault. The single story involving Thor in a potentially sexual context is his journey to Thrymheim dressed as Freya to retrieve his hammer. But this is comedy, Thor in drag, tricking a giant, not predation. This contrast cannot be explained away by suggesting different cultural values around sexuality. Both Greek and Norse cultures were patriarchal warrior societies that accepted practices modern audiences would reject. The difference lies specifically in what behaviors they attributed to their supreme deities. The Norse imagined Thor as a defender, a god who protected Midgard from chaos and destruction. The Greeks imagined Zeus as a taker, a god whose desires overrode all mortal rights and whose power made resistance meaningless. The question that emerges from this comparison cuts deep into cultural psychology. What does it mean that Greek civilization, the culture that gave Western thought so many of its foundational concepts, built their supreme deity around normalized sexual violence? What does it reveal that they told these stories without apparent discomfort, that they carved them into temple friezes and painted them on ceremonial vessels? The sanitization continues today. Museums display vases depicting Zeus's assaults without content warnings. University courses teach these myths as classical literature without examining their disturbing implications. The artistic legacy, those Rembrandt and Michelangelo paintings, those Renaissance sculptures, maintain their prestige without reckoning with what they actually depict. We have inherited this cultural blind spot, the ability to discuss Zeus's transformations as creative mythology, while avoiding the fact that these transformations served rape. The transformation element itself deserves deeper consideration. Zeus did not approach his victims in his true form and overpower them through direct force, though his divine power certainly would have made that possible. Instead, he chose deception. He became the gentle bull, the frightened swan, the golden rain, forms that removed even the possibility of understanding what was happening until too late. This suggests a psychology more disturbing than simple violent assault. Zeus's methods demonstrate calculation, planning, an understanding that his victims would resist if they knew his true nature, and a willingness to deceive them to achieve his goals. Greek culture did not merely tolerate this behavior, they enshrined it as mythology's central dynamic. Zeus's affairs, his transformations, his pursuit of mortals who caught his eye, these formed the backbone of countless myths, the engine driving much of Greek legendary narrative. Heroes traced their lineage to Zeus's assaults and wore that heritage as honor. Cities claimed founding by his victims' children. The entire mythological system normalized predation as a source of glory. We cannot undo this legacy, cannot retroactively change what the Greeks believed or how they structured their mythology. But we can recognize what we have inherited and question why this particular mythology maintains such prestige. We can ask why Zeus's behavior receives such different treatment than identical behavior in contemporary contexts. We can notice the discomfort that rises when these familiar myths are described with accurate, rather than sanitized language. The Greeks built their king of gods as a predator. They accepted it, celebrated it, and passed those stories down through millennia. That acceptance reveals something disturbing about cultural capacity for normalizing violence when it flows from recognized authority. Zeus wore divine right as permission for any act. The transformation continues today, not Zeus's shape-shifting, but our own transformation of assault into mythology, violence into classical heritage, horror into art. High above the peaks of Mount Olympus, where mortal eyes could never reach, and where the air itself transformed into something too pure for human lungs, Zeus the Thunderer held court in halls that shamed the very concept of earthly architecture. The palace of the Olympian king rose in tiers of white marble, veined with gold, its columns thicker than the oldest oaks, its foundations resting not on stone, but on clouds that never dispersed, never darkened, never brought the rain that mortals below prayed for in their drought-stricken fields. Here, in this realm of perpetual sunshine and impossible geometry, the immortal gods reclined on couches inlaid with ivory and amber, drinking nectar that flowed like honey but burned like starlight, eating ambrosia that renewed their deathless flesh with every bite. The great hall itself stretched beyond what mortal measurement could capture. Hesiod wrote of golden floor tiles that reflected the faces of gods back at themselves in endless repetition, a architecture of narcissism made manifest. The walls bore no scenes of battle or struggle, but rather depicted the titanomachy already won. The old gods already imprisoned in Tartarus, the new order already established and eternal. The ceiling opened to a sky that never stormed except by Zeus's deliberate command, never darkened except when he willed it, a cosmos utterly subject to his whim. Fresh flowers that never wilted lined the pathways between the feasting couches, their perfume mingling with the sweet smoke of offerings that rose from the mortal world far below, tribute extracted through fear and enforced through lightning bolts that could shatter mountains. This was hierarchy made into landscape, privilege transformed into paradise. The 12 Olympians occupied the highest tier of the palace, their thrones arranged in a council chamber where they debated the fates of mortals with the casual detachment of children arranging toy soldiers. Apollo's lyre played music that simply existed in the air, requiring no musician, while the muses danced in perfect synchronized movements that they had performed for uncounted centuries and would perform for uncounted more. The lower gods, the lesser immortals, the nymphs and minor deities, they occupied descending levels of the palace, an architecture that reflected status, that made power into physical height, that ensured everyone knew their place in the cosmic order. And far below, impossibly far below, lay the world of mortals, where farmers broke their backs in fields, where mothers wept over children claimed by plague, where warriors bled out their lives in battles fought, because some god had taken offense at some imagined slight. The Olympians looked down on this suffering with something between amusement and indifference. They meddled, certainly, playing their games of favoritism and revenge. But they never truly descended except in disguise, never truly participated except as tourists sampling exotic experiences. Zeus himself transformed into swans and bulls and golden showers to seduce mortal women. But these were diversions, entertainments, the hobbies of an immortal with eternity to fill. The distance between Olympus and Earth was not merely physical but philosophical, a chasm that represented the Mediterranean worldview of fundamental separation between the divine and mortal realms. The gods had won their war, established their order, and now they simply maintained it through overwhelming force and the occasional demonstration of power. When mortals grew too proud, too numerous, too loud in their complaints, Zeus might flood the world, might send plagues, might turn entire cities into cautionary tales. This was order maintained through fear, stability purchased through the constant implied threat of divine retribution. The golden palace above the clouds required the suffering below to maintain its meaning, its privilege, its shine. Now shift your vision northward, to the realms where the sun barely rises in winter and barely sets in summer, where the very concept of eternity seems like a southern delusion. In Asgard, the great hall of the Aesir, Valhalla rose with wooden beams thick as shipmasts, its roof thatched with shields that had tasted real battle, its walls constructed from the ashwood of Yggdrasil itself, the world tree whose roots reached down into freezing springs and whose branches held up the sky through sheer stubborn endurance. Here Thor Odinson sat, not on a golden throne, but on a high seat carved with runes that told of battles fought and battles yet to come, drinking mead from a horn that never seemed to empty, but would someday run dry, feasting on meat from the boar, Saehrimnir that was slaughtered each evening and reborn each morning, a cycle of death and renewal that pervaded every aspect of Norse cosmology. The architecture of Valhalla spoke a different language than Olympus. The hall stretched long rather than tall, built for warriors sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches, for the Einherjar, the honored dead who had died with weapons in their hands, and now trained daily for the final battle they knew was coming. The walls bore weapons not as decoration, but as tools awaiting use. Spears hung in racks, their points kept sharp. Swords rested in scabbards that would be seized when the horn sounded. The shields that roofed the hall were not symbolic. They had been carried into real combat, bore the marks of real blows, would be carried into combat again when Ragnarok came and the sky itself split open. Because that was the essential truth that every god in Asgard lived with, the knowledge that made their feasting somehow more urgent more present, more real than the eternal banquets of Olympus. They knew how the story ended. The Norns, those three sisters who sat at the base of Yggdrasil weaving fate itself, had already woven the final tapestry. Odin knew because he had hanged himself on the world tree to gain the wisdom of runes, had traded his eye for knowledge, had learned the day and hour of his own death. Thor knew because in the spaces between thunder, in the silence after battle, that knowledge sat in his chest like a cold stone. Ragnarok was coming. The Fimbul winter would descend. 3 winters with no summer between them. Brother would turn against brother, the bonds of kinship would dissolve, and then the enemies that Thor had spent eternity fighting would finally break through. Fenrir the wolf would snap his chains. Jormungandr the world serpent would rise from the ocean depths, poison dripping from fangs that could pierce the sky. The fire giants from Muspelheim would march across the Bifrost Bridge, and Surtur with his flaming sword would set all the 9 realms ablaze. The halls would burn. The gods would die. Thor himself would kill the world serpent, and then take 9 steps before falling dead from its venom. A victory that was simultaneously a defeat, a triumph that meant nothing because everything was ending anyway. This was not order maintained through power, but heroism enacted despite futility. Thor did not defend the borders of Asgard from his high seat, issuing commands to lesser beings who did the actual fighting. He went himself to the edges of the realm, where Jotunheim pressed against the world of gods, where the frost giants and mountain giants constantly tested the boundaries, constantly pushed against the fragile order that kept the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. His hammer Mjolnir was not a scepter, not a symbol of authority kept polished and pristine. It was a weapon used so frequently that its handle had been worn smooth. A tool that returned to his hand again and again because the work was never finished, could never be finished, would continue right up until the moment when everything failed. The geography of the Norse cosmos reflected this constant struggle. The 9 realms were not neatly ordered tiers descending from divine perfection to mortal imperfection. They were interconnected worlds held together by Yggdrasil, the world tree that was itself constantly under assault. The dragon, Nidhogg, gnawed eternally at its roots. Stags ate at its branches. The tree endured not through invulnerability, but through constant renewal, drinking from the wells of fate, sustained by the efforts of beings who knew that their labor would ultimately fail, but continued anyway. Midgard, the realm of humans, was not some distant concern far below divine notice, but a Middle-earth connected directly to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, guarded by Heimdall, who stood eternal watch, who would blow the Gjallarhorn to signal the beginning of the end. The gods had created humans from driftwood found on a beach, had given them breath and warmth and thought, not as toys or subjects, but as participants in the cosmic drama, as allies in the struggle against the giants, against the forces of chaos and entropy that surrounded all the realms of order like an ocean surrounds islands. When Thor defended Asgard's borders, he was simultaneously defending Midgard, because the boundaries were permeable, because the giants who threatened the gods also threatened mortals, because there was no fundamental separation between divine concerns and human survival. The walls that surrounded Asgard had been built by a giant mason who had demanded the sun and moon and the goddess Freya as payment, who had nearly completed the work before the gods cheated him, and Thor killed him, a story that revealed the precariousness of divine security. The fact that even the walls of heaven had required trickery and violence to complete. This was the essential difference between Mediterranean and Norse divine cosmology. Zeus ruled from Olympus through the assumption of permanence, through the victory already won over the Titans, through the establishment of an order that would persist forever because he had the power to make it persist. His rule was enforced through demonstrations of overwhelming force, through the thunderbolt that could strike anyone anywhere, through the promise that rebellion would be crushed as it had been crushed before. The golden palace above the clouds was possible because the war was over, because stability had been achieved, because the hierarchy was fixed and unchangeable. Thor held his position in Asgard knowing that all positions were temporary, that all halls would burn, that the hierarchy itself was doomed. His heroism was not the heroism of the triumphant general, but the heroism of the soldier who holds the line, knowing the line will break, who fights the battle, knowing the battle will be lost, who defends the realm knowing the realm will fall. He went to the borders because someone had to go, because the alternative to doomed heroism was immediate chaos, because the choice was not between victory and defeat, but between fighting and surrendering, between a cosmos that endures for a time and a cosmos that collapses immediately. In Olympus, the gods played politics because they had the luxury of eternity to scheme and maneuver. In Valhalla, the gods prepared for war because they knew exactly how much time remained. Both were hierarchies, both were kingdoms of the divine, but one assumed forever while the other counted down to nothing. The blood of gods runs differently than mortal blood. It carries with it not just life, but destiny, curse, and prophecy. When we examine the children born of Zeus and Thor, we find two fundamentally different visions of divinity, two opposing philosophies written in the flesh and fates of divine offspring. One god scattered his seed across the ancient world like a conqueror marking territory, leaving behind a trail of broken women and doomed heroes. The other chose differently, investing in fewer children, thinking not of conquest but of continuation, of who would carry the hammer when the world burned and began again. Zeus fathered dozens upon dozens of children. Some accounts claim more than 100, though the exact number vanishes into the mists of myth and the silence of countless mortal women who bore children they never asked for. These were not children born of love, in most cases. They were the products of violence, deception, and divine entitlement. Zeus took what he wanted when he wanted it, transforming himself into whatever form would grant him access to his chosen victim. A swan for Leda, a shower of gold for Danae locked in her bronze tower, a bull for Europa, an eagle for Aegina. The transformations themselves reveal the predatory nature of these encounters. These were not romances. They were hunting expeditions. Consider the story of Semele, a Theban princess who caught the eye of the king of gods. Zeus came to her in mortal form, concealing his true nature, and she became pregnant with Dionysus. But Hera, Zeus's wife, consumed by the jealous rage that defined her existence, disguised herself as an old woman and convinced Semele to ask her divine lover to reveal himself in his true form. Semele made Zeus promise to grant her one wish, and bound by his oath, he had no choice when she asked to see him as he truly was. His divine radiance burned her to ash instantly. Zeus managed to save the unborn Dionysus by sewing the child into his own thigh, but Semele was gone, obliterated by the very glory of the god who had claimed her. This is how Zeus loved. This is what it meant to bear the child of the sky god. His children spread across the Mediterranean like evidence scattered across a crime scene. Each one tells a story, and most of those stories end in blood. Heracles, perhaps the most famous of all Zeus's children, embodied the tragedy of divine inheritance more perfectly than any other. Born to Alcmene after Zeus disguised himself as her husband, Heracles possessed superhuman strength and courage, yet his life was an unending series of torments. Hera, unable to strike directly at Zeus, focused her vengeance on his innocent son. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle. When he survived and grew to manhood, marrying and having children of his own, she sent madness upon him. In his delirium, Heracles murdered his own wife and children, killing them with his bare hands. When sanity returned and he saw what he had done, his grief was so profound that it could only be expiated through the 12 labors, tasks designed to kill him. He survived them all through sheer will and strength, but the madness returned throughout his life. Even his death came through agony, poisoned blood burning through his skin, driving him to build his own funeral pyre. Heracles died screaming, burning alive on Mount Oeta, and Zeus, his father, finally intervened only at the very end, lifting his son to Olympus and granting him immortality. Too late. Always too late. Perseus offers another variation on the theme of cursed victory. Born to Danae after Zeus came to her as a shower of gold, impregnating her while she was locked away in a tower, Perseus grew up to become one of the great heroes. He slew Medusa, rescued Andromeda, and fulfilled the prophecy that he would kill his grandfather Acrisius. But examine the details closely. Perseus spent his childhood adrift at sea, locked in a chest with his mother because his grandfather feared the prophecy of death. He killed Medusa by cutting off her head while she slept. Hardly an heroic confrontation. The rescue of Andromeda involved turning her would-be husband and his supporters to stone, creating an entire courtyard of frozen corpses. And when the prophecy finally came true, it happened by accident during athletic games, a discus thrown awry that struck Acrisius in the head. Perseus achieved everything expected of a hero, yet his story is soaked in displacement, accidental violence, and the weight of prophecy that made every achievement feel hollow. He won, but what exactly did he win? The fulfillment of a curse is not a prize. Look at Tantalus, son of Zeus, who was invited to dine with the gods on Olympus. Seeking to test their omniscience, he killed his own son Pelops, cooked him, and served him to the gods as a meal. The gods, horrified by this obscenity, restored Pelops to life and created a punishment for Tantalus that would define eternal torment. He stands forever in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. When he bends to drink, the water recedes. When he reaches for fruit, the branches pull away. This is the mind of a son of Zeus, a consciousness that thought serving his murdered child to the gods was an appropriate test of their divinity. This is the inheritance of the sky god. The Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux, twin sons born to Leda along with Helen and Clytemnestra, after Zeus came to her as a swan, demonstrate yet another facet of Zeus's cursed bloodline. Castor was mortal, Pollux divine, and when Castor died in battle, Pollux was inconsolable. He begged Zeus to let him share his immortality with his brother, and Zeus agreed, allowing them to alternate between Olympus and the underworld, each spending half their time among the living and half among the dead. This sounds almost romantic, a story of brotherly devotion, until you consider what it actually means. Two brothers, neither fully alive nor fully dead, caught in an endless cycle of partial existence. The divine gift becomes another variation of eternal punishment. Helen of Troy herself, Zeus's daughter through Leda, became the proximate cause of a war that killed thousands and destroyed an entire civilization. She was so beautiful that her abduction launched 1,000 ships, but nowhere in her story does she possess agency. She is taken by Paris, fought over by men, blamed for deaths she did not cause, and remembered not as a person, but as an object, the most beautiful object in the world. This too is part of Zeus's legacy, daughters who become weapons and prizes, whose divine inheritance makes them targets. The pattern repeats endlessly. Minos, king of Crete, and son of Zeus through Europa, who established a dynasty built on human sacrifice to the Minotaur. Aeacus, who became a judge of the dead in the underworld, spending eternity weighing the sins of others. Sarpedon, who died at Troy, a son of Zeus killed in the very war started because of another of Zeus's children. Each offspring carries the weight of their father's nature, and that nature tends toward violence, toward tragedy, toward fates that crush the individual beneath the wheel of divine drama. Now turn your attention north, to the frozen realms where Thor walks beneath skies that shimmer with aurora light. Thor fathered far fewer children than Zeus. The exact number varies depending on the source, but the difference is not just quantitative. It is philosophical. Thor's children are not scattered evidence of crimes. They are intentional inheritances, links in a chain designed to carry forward into a future that stretches beyond the death of gods. Modi and Magni stand at the center of this different vision of divine legacy. Their names mean wrath and strength, and they are Thor's sons, born to embody aspects of their father's nature. But unlike Zeus's children who are defined by their suffering and their tragic fates, Modi and Magni are defined by what they will survive. The prophecies of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, describe a final battle in which nearly all the gods will die. Thor himself will kill Jormungandr, the world's serpent, and then take 9 steps before falling dead from the creature's venom. Odin will be devoured by Fenrir, the wolf. Heimdall and Loki will kill each other. The world will burn. But after the fire, after the flood, after the death and destruction, a new world will emerge from the waters. And in that new world, Modi and Magni will walk forth from the ruins carrying Mjolnir, their father's hammer. This is inheritance with purpose. Thor does not scatter his divinity carelessly across the world. He invests it in sons who are meant to continue, to carry forward the weapons and wisdom of the old world into the new. There are no stories of Modi and Magni suffering from divine curses. There are no tales of them driven mad by jealous goddesses or crushed beneath the weight of prophecy. They exist for a specific purpose, to be the bridge between worlds, to ensure that strength and courage survive even the death of gods. Ruger, Thor's daughter, whose name means strength or power, represents another facet of this intentional legacy. She's betrothed to the dwarf Alvis, and the story of that betrothal reveals Thor as a father, protective and clever, rather than simply violent. When Alvis comes to claim Ruger, Thor delays him with questions, asking him to prove his wisdom by naming everything in all the worlds. The dwarf, eager to demonstrate his knowledge, answers question after question through the night, not realizing that Thor is simply stalling until sunrise. When dawn comes, the sunlight turns Alvis to stone, as it does to all dwarves caught above ground in daylight. Thor protects his daughter not through violence, but through cunning. He is a father, not just a force of nature. The contrast illuminates two fundamentally different understandings of what it means to be a god and what it means to create life. Zeus's legacy is quantity without quality, propagation without protection, desire without responsibility. His children are markers of his power, evidence of his reach, but they are not his priority. When they suffer, when they die, when they are driven mad or cursed or destroyed, Zeus does nothing or acts only at the last possible moment. His love, such as it is, comes too late to matter. Thor's legacy is about continuation and purpose. His children are fewer because each one matters more. They are not accidents or conquests. They are inheritors, designed to carry forward what is essential. When Thor dies at Ragnarok, he does not die with his legacy scattered and suffering across the world. He dies knowing that his sons will survive, that they will carry Mjolnir into a new world, that something essential will continue beyond the death of everything. The offspring of these gods reveal their true natures more clearly than any of their own deeds. Zeus is revealed as fundamentally self-centered, his divine power used primarily for personal gratification without regard for consequences. The suffering of his children is acceptable collateral damage in his pursuit of desire. Thor is revealed as someone who thinks beyond himself, who understands legacy not as quantity but as quality, not as conquest but as continuation. His children are meant to survive him, to outlive the twilight of gods and carry something essential forward. This is why the study of divine offspring matters. Children are the ultimate revelation, the clearest window into true nature that exists. Zeus's dozens of cursed, suffering, doomed children tell us exactly who he is. Thor's fewer, intentional, prophesied survivors tell us exactly who he is. One god sees children as evidence of his power. The other sees them as the purpose of his power. One creates quantity and tragedy. The other creates continuation and hope. The blood of gods runs differently, and we can trace its path through the fates of those who carry it forward into the mortal world. There are two ways for a god to rule forever. The first is to simply never die. The second is to die magnificently, knowing the end will come, knowing it must come, and to face it anyway with weapon in hand and defiance in your throat. Zeus chose the first path. Thor never had a choice. Look up at Olympus now, if you dare, and witness what eternal victory truly means. Zeus sits on his throne of storm and absolute power, and he will sit there tomorrow, and the day after that, and 10,000 years from now. When he defeated his father Kronos and cast the Titans down into the suffocating darkness of Tartarus, when he claimed the lightning bolt as his symbol and the sky as his domain, something terrible happened. The universe locked into place. The cosmic order froze like water turned to ice, and Zeus became the keystone in an arch that can never crumble. This is not the immortality of fairy tales, some gentle blessing of endless youth and happiness. This is the cold immortality of tyranny, of power that recognizes no limit and no end. Zeus cannot be killed, not by blade, not by poison, not by conspiracy or revolution. The younger gods who might challenge him can never succeed because the very fabric of reality will not permit his overthrow. After his victory, after he won the great war against the Titans, the rules changed. Or perhaps they were always there, written into the foundation of the Greek cosmos. The king of the gods is eternal. Walk the halls of Olympus in your mind and feel the weight of forever pressing down on everything. The same faces at the same feasts for centuries beyond counting. The same petty jealousies, the same affairs and rages and reconciliations, playing out in an endless cycle. Zeus transforms into animals to seduce mortals. Hera plots her revenge. Athena schemes. Apollo plays his lyre. Tomorrow they will do these things again. In 1,000 years, they will still be doing them. The gods do not grow. They do not learn. They do not change in any fundamental way, because change requires the possibility of ending, and ending is the one thing they cannot do. Consider the horror of it. Zeus knows he will never face a final reckoning. Every choice he makes, every cruelty he inflicts, every mortal woman he ruins, every hero he destroys on a whim, all of it happens in an eternal present where consequences never truly come home. He turned Io into a cow to hide her from Hera. He chained Prometheus to a rock to have his liver eaten daily by an eagle for the crime of helping humanity. He has done 10,000 terrible things, and he will do 10,000 more, and there is no force in the cosmos that will make him stop, make him pay, make him end. The throne is comfortable. The ambrosia is sweet. The worship rises from the mortal world below like smoke from endless sacrifices. Nothing fundamentally changes. This is what it means to be a god who cannot die. This is what victory looks like when it lasts forever. Static. Stagnant. All. Eternal. The throne rooms of Olympus will never be empty. The sky will never lack a master. And Zeus will never know the one thing that gives existence meaning, the one thing that makes choices matter and courage real. He will never know an ending. Now turn your eyes north, to the frozen lands where different gods walk beneath different stars, and witness what prophecy looks like when it promises not eternal rule, but certain death. The Norse gods know how they will die. They have always known. The Volva, the Cirrus, spoke the doom of the world in the hearing of the gods themselves, and they listened, and they understood, and they prepared for it anyway. Ragnarok. The twilight of the gods. The end of everything. It is written. It is known. It is coming. Thor knows that one day the sky will split, and the world serpent Jormungandr will rise from the ocean depths, where it has coiled around Midgard for ages beyond memory. He knows that he will face the serpent in battle. He knows that he will kill it. And he knows, with the terrible certainty of prophecy already spoken, that the serpent will kill him too. The Norse gods are immortal in the sense that they do not age, that disease does not touch them, that ordinary weapons cannot harm them. But they can die. They will die. The future is not frozen in place around them like ice. The future is fire and flood and the breaking of all bonds, and they walk toward it with open eyes. Imagine living with that knowledge. Every day that Thor lifts his hammer Mjolnir, every giant he battles, every defense of Asgard and Midgard, all of it happens in the shadow of his prophesied death. He is not fighting to preserve an eternal order. He is fighting knowing that everything he protects will burn. The courage that requires is a kind the Greek gods will never need and can never understand. And then the day comes. The signs have been building. Winters have grown longer and more bitter. The sun and moon have been swallowed by the wolves that chase them across the sky. Earthquakes shake the foundations of the 9 worlds. The wolf Fenrir has broken free from the magical chains that bound him. The fire giant Surtur marches from Muspelheim with a sword that burns brighter than the sun. The dead rise from Hell's kingdom on a ship made of fingernails. The final battle begins. The field is called Vigrid, and it stretches 100 leagues in every direction, and it runs red with blood and black with poison. Jormungandr rises from the ocean, and the water pours off its scales like cataracts, like floods, like the sea itself trying to follow the serpent onto land. It is so vast that its body creates new valleys in the earth where it drags across the ground. Its eyes are yellow with ancient hate, and its fangs drip venom that hisses and burns where it touches the soil. The serpent has grown in the deep places of the world, fed on hate and bitterness, and the certain knowledge of this moment. Thor strides forward to meet it. He does not hesitate. He has known this was coming since before the worlds were fully formed. His hammer is in his hand, lightning crackling around him like a crown, like armor, like the wrath of the storm given form. He is the protector of Midgard, the defender of gods and men, and if this is his ending, then he will make it count. They meet in the wasteland, god and serpent, thunder and poison. The serpent strikes first, lunging with jaws wide enough to swallow mountains. Thor dodges, rolls, comes up swinging and Mjolnir in an arc that catches the serpent's skull with a sound like the world cracking open. Scales shatter. Blood, black as tar and hot as forge fire, sprays across the battlefield. The serpent screams, a sound that makes the sky shudder, and coils back for another strike. Again and again they clash. Thor's hammer breaks the serpent's fangs, shatters its ribs, pulps the flesh beneath those ancient scales. But the serpent is vast, and every wound only makes it more desperate, more vicious. Its tail sweeps across the field and crushes a dozen fighting gods and giants beneath its weight. Its venom sprays in arcs melting stone, turning the earth to bubbling slag. Thor's arms are burning with exhaustion. His breath comes in ragged gasps. Lightning still flickers around him, but weaker now, the storm beginning to fail. Still, he fights. Still he swings the hammer. Because this is what it means to be a god who knows death is coming. You fight anyway. You fight especially. You fight because the choice to stand and face oblivion is the only choice that matters when nothing lasts forever. The serpent rears back one final time, gathering itself for a strike that will end either Thor or itself, or both. Venom drips from its broken jaws. Its eyes blaze with hate and pain, and the bitter knowledge that even if it wins, the world is ending anyway. There is no future for the serpent either. There is only this moment, this battle, this last defiant act before everything burns. They strike simultaneously. Thor's hammer catches the serpent between the eyes with every ounce of strength the thunder god has left. The skull crumples. The brain turns to pulp. The serpent's body convulses once, twice, and then goes still, crashing to the earth like a falling mountain range, shaking the world with the impact of its death. But the serpent's fangs have found their mark too. Thor staggers backward, and for a moment he thinks he has survived, that somehow prophecy was wrong. Then the venom hits his blood. It burns like liquid fire, like swallowing the sun, like every nerve in his body turning to molten agony. He can feel it spreading, racing through his veins, shutting down his organs one by one. He takes a step away from the serpent's corpse. His vision is blurring. His hammer feels impossibly heavy. Another step. The world is spinning now. He can hear the sounds of battle continuing around him. Other gods fighting their own prophesied dooms. Odin facing the wolf, Fenrir. Freyr falling to Surtur's burning sword. Everything ending exactly as it was always meant to end. A third step. His legs are giving out. The venom has reached his heart, and it stutters, stops, starts again weakly. 4 steps. 5. Then down. 6. He is walking through a wasteland of bodies and blood and burning sky. The prophecy said 9 steps. He wonders distantly if he will make it. 7 steps. He falls to his knees. The hammer slips from his fingers and lands in the poisoned earth with a sound like a closing tomb. 8 steps. He tries to crawl. His arms will not support him. He collapses face first into the dirt, into the ash, into the ending of everything. 9 steps. Thor, son of Odin, god of thunder, protector of Midgard, lies dead in a wasteland as the world burns around his corpse. The serpent that was his doom lies dead behind him. Both prophecies fulfilled. Both deaths bought with courage and pain, and the terrible freedom of knowing that nothing lasts forever. So the fight itself must be enough. This is the difference. This is the gulf between these gods that no amount of shared mythology can bridge. Zeus will never know this moment. Zeus will never face an end he cannot avoid. Zeus will never have to choose between eternal cowardice and mortal courage, because for him there is no mortality, no final test, no last proving ground where the measure of a soul is taken and found wanting or worthy. Thor dies. The Greek gods endure. And in that difference lies an entire philosophy of existence. The Norse cosmos is not static. It is a cycle of creation and destruction, of building and burning, of gods who fight knowing they will lose, because the fight itself is what matters. The universe will end. A new universe will be born from the ashes. Different gods, different stories, but the same essential truth: nothing lasts. Everything changes. Death gives meaning to life. The Greek cosmos is eternal stagnation dressed in robes of glory. The same gods on the same mountain, making the same mistakes forever, learning nothing, changing nothing, ruling an order that can never evolve because its masters can never die. Which is more terrible? To die heroically in defense of a world you know is doomed? Or to live forever in a paradise that can never grow, never change, never end? Thor would tell you that 9 poisoned steps are worth more than 10,000 years on an eternal throne. Zeus would call him a fool and pour another cup of ambrosia and settle back into his seat of power that will never be empty. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And that is the final difference between thunder in the north and lightning in the south. One ends, one endures. One is a story, one is a prison. Both are called immortality. Only one is called freedom. We carve our nightmares into heaven and call them gods. We always have. But what does it say about us when the faces we give to thunder are so different, so revealing, so deeply unsettling in what they mirror back? The Greeks gave Zeus a throne that would never crumble. They made him eternal, unchallengeable, a predator king whose power expressed itself through dominance and desire. His myths overflow with conquest, with transformation used as disguise for violence, with divine right wielded as justification for acts that would horrify us in any mortal man. This wasn't accidental. This was a culture writing its own values across the cosmos, normalizing the exploitation they practiced on Earth by projecting it onto heaven itself. If the king of gods ruled through fear and sexual violence, what did that say about earthly kings, about empires built on subjugation, about power that recognized no limits and expected no consequences? The Norse saw the same lightning and heard something else entirely. They gave Thor a hammer meant for protection, not domination. They built into his story an ending, a final battle where even gods would fall. Ragnarok wasn't a footnote. It was the point. Courage mattered precisely because destruction was inevitable, because the fight was already lost before it began. This was a people who understood that empires crumble, that winter always comes, that nothing golden lasts. So they built their divine mirror to reflect not what they wished to be, but what they valued in the darkness: defiance without hope of victory, strength spent protecting a world destined to end. Which vision is more terrifying? Eternal tyranny with a divine face, or cosmic annihilation written to the fabric of existence from the beginning? The question itself reveals something uncomfortable, that maybe we need our gods to be terrible in ways that justify or console us through our own terror. We still don't know if we create them or they shape us, whether thunder rolls because we need it to, or whether we simply listen and hear what we've already become. The sky still sounds the same. The thunder still rolls. But what do you hear in it now? Oh. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.